What if one wrong step, one wrong train, could tie two strangers together in a way neither of them ever expected? That was the question hanging in the cold Wyoming air the day Thatcher Cain's life began to change. The late spring chill clung to the Wyoming territory like a stubborn ghost. Patches of old snow still lived on the north slopes, refusing to melt. Thatcher Cain barely felt the cold in his bones anymore. 40 years in this land had hardened him to weather, hunger, work, and grief. What he could not harden was the empty space inside him, the ache left behind when he buried his wife Margaret 3 years earlier. His ranch sat quiet beneath a thin curtain of morning mist. The land she had loved, the 200 acres they built together, felt heavier since her passing. Thatcher stood near an old cottonwood grove, tightening a strand of barbed wire. Deer had trampled the fence. It was a small problem, but problems had a way of piling up like snowdrifts. 6 calves lost to sickness last month, wolves singing on the ridges every night, and silence. Endless silence inside a house that used to be filled with Margaret's laughter. He slammed a staple into the post. The sharp sound cracked through the cold air. Fixing fences was better than thinking. Thinking took him to places he didn't want to go. Down in the valley, a train whistle echoed, thin and lonely. The eastbound train leaving Millwater Depot, folks on board heading somewhere new. Somewhere warmer, somewhere alive. Thatcher didn't look up. The world kept moving, but he felt stuck behind, frozen in a life that had stopped the day Margaret closed her eyes. He finished the fence and turned toward town. He needed supplies, feed, coffee, nails. Maybe he also needed to see Jake Monroe, the only man who had known him before grief carved him into a different shape. Maybe he just needed a nod from another living soul. Miles away, on a train heading toward Wyoming, Eloise Mercer felt each jolt of the passenger car as a promise. The promise of escape. The promise of hope. The promise of a man named Thatcher Cain. The car smelled of coal smoke, damp wool, and too many bodies. But to Eloise, it was the scent of freedom. She'd spent 2 years trapped in Mr. Garrett's boarding house in Cincinnati, breathing the sour air of boiled cabbage and cheap pomade. Garrett watched everything, controlled everything, expected everything. His kindness always felt one breath away from something darker. So she wrote an advertisement, a simple plea for honest work or an honest match. She never thought anyone would answer, but one letter came. Thatcher Cain. Millwater, Wyoming territory. His words were plain, steady, and full of quiet promise. He said he owned land and wanted a wife to build a future with. He said he respected hard work. He said he believed in starting fresh. Eloise clutched the letter in her lap, folded 100 times, its edges worn soft. Inside her Bible, tucked against the Psalms, the paper felt warm. Real. Safe. She had nothing but 2 dresses, a small tin of herbs her mother taught her to use, and her dignity. It was enough for a new life. She swallowed hard as the train wheels clattered. Was she truly going to meet a stranger and become his bride? Fear flickered, but hope was stronger. Anything was better than going back to Garrett. Back in Millwater, Jake Monroe stacked peach tins in his general store. He was 38, with the calm smile of a man who knew everyone's secrets but rarely repeated them. The store was the center of the town. News, gossip, and truth all drifted through its door. He heard the train whistle and checked the clock. On time. He swallowed back a knot of unease. Because he knew something Thatcher did not. He had done a foolish thing, a dangerous thing. A thing he prayed would save his friend instead of ruin him. Jake had written the letter, not Thatcher. He dipped his pen into ink and forged Thatcher's name because he was tired of watching Thatcher rot inside his grief. Tired of seeing a good man disappear. So he had sent for a bride Thatcher had not asked for, a woman who believed in a promise Thatcher had never made, and today she was arriving. As Jake worried, the wind rattled the door. Bart Hutchkins slouched in, followed by 2 of his drinking partners. Bart was a bitter man, always hungry for a reason to sneer. Jake kept his voice calm, but Bart's eyes glinted with ugly amusement. Some women travel a long way for a promise, Bart said. Would be a shame if they arrived and found out it wasn't real. Jake's stomach twisted. Outside, the wind picked up. Storm clouds crawled over the ridges. And far away, Thatcher Cain saddled his horse to pick up feed at 3 Pines, unaware that the freight train waiting there would become the wrong train. Unaware that the blizzard moving in would swallow the tracks. Unaware that the woman holding his name, his forged name, was only hours away from standing on a platform alone. And unaware that fate, cold and wild as a Wyoming storm, was about to tie their lives together. He rode down from the high country as snow began to fall, thick, heavy flakes for late spring. He reached 3 Pines just as 2 trains thundered into the station, a passenger train for Millwater and a freight train headed west. Snow made the world a blur. Men shouted. Steam hissed. Wind whipped snow sideways. Thatcher, hurrying, grabbed a rail and pulled himself onto what he thought was the passenger car. It wasn't. It was the express freight. The door slammed shut behind him. The train lurched the wrong way. By the time he realized his mistake, Millwater was vanishing into swirling white. He cursed under his breath. 10 minutes later, the train dropped an empty car on a lonely siding in the middle of nowhere and left him standing in a blizzard with nothing but a boarded-up shelter. That was when he saw her, a woman sitting alone on the bench inside the tiny platform house. Thin coat, blue lips, a small valise at her feet, eyes wide with fear and hope. He stepped inside, shaken from the cold. "Trains are gone," he said. "I know," she whispered. "The one I needed. It didn't stop." He nodded. She looked at him with trembling hands and said the words that froze him more than the wind outside. "I am waiting for someone, a man from Millwater, a Mr. Thatcher Cain." Do you know him?" Thatcher stared at her, and the storm around them suddenly felt quiet. Here began the mistake that changed everything. What if the truth you feared most was the very truth that could break 2 lives at once? That was the weight in the air as Eloise Mercer looked into Thatcher Cain's eyes and waited for his answer. Thatcher felt the world tilt beneath him. Snow howled outside the tiny shelter, but nothing was louder than the words hanging between them. Eloise stood small and pale, clutching her valise like her life depended on it. "I'm Thatcher Cain," he said at last. A wave of relief washed over her face. It struck him hard, that relief. Too pure, too trusting, too undeserved. Then confusion crept in. Her smile faltered. "But you weren't at the Millwater depot. Your letter said you would meet me there." "My letter," he repeated, tasting the bitterness of the lie someone else had written in his name. He took a slow breath and forced himself to face it. "I didn't write any letter, Miss Mercer." Her breath caught. The hope in her eyes flickered. "What do you mean?" Thatcher reached out his hand. She placed the folded paper into his palm. It was worn from her reading it over and over. He recognized the stationery immediately. Raised circle in the corner. Millwater General Store. Jake's store. His oldest friend. His stomach turned. He read the words full of steady promises, of honest work, of needing a woman's partnership. Words a lonely widow might write, but not words he had written. Not yet. "I'm sorry," he said, handing it back. "This isn't my signature." She stared at the page as if it had betrayed her. A tiny crack formed in her voice. "But I came all this way." The wind punched through the broken boards of the shelter. Snow sprayed across the floor. She shivered, dragging his sheepskin coat tighter around herself. Thatcher swallowed the lump of guilt in his throat. "We can't stay out here," he said. "Storm's getting worse." Together they forced open the door of the abandoned freight office. Inside was cold, dark, and smelled of dust and mice. Thatcher found a rusted potbelly stove, shaved kindling from an old crate, and coaxed a weak flame to life. Eloise sat on an overturned barrel, her hands gripping the coat he had given her. For an hour they sat in a silence made heavy by the truth between them. Finally she spoke, her voice a trembling whisper. "What am I supposed to do now?" Thatcher looked at her, really looked. She had traveled across the country believing in a promise someone else had forged. She had no family, no money, no place to go. And in a town like Millwater, a woman alone was a rumor waiting to happen. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I'll take you to Millwater when the storm clears," he said. "We'll figure it out." She nodded, but her disappointment was a living thing between them. The storm raged all night. They took turns feeding the stove. Snow piled at the doorway. Wind moaned through the walls. Thatcher offered her jerky, which she refused politely. Later, when she shivered too hard to hide it, he draped his coat around her again. She didn't refuse that. Near dawn, Eloise fell asleep, curled close to the stove. Thatcher watched her for a long time. There was a gentleness in her quiet breathing, a strength in the way she had kept herself composed through fear, hunger, and heartbreak. Something inside him shifted, a place he had sealed shut long ago. The storm finally broke, leaving a world buried in fresh snow. Tracks gone, roads drowned in white. There was only one way forward. He woke her gently. "Miss Mercer, the road home's buried. We'll ride to my ranch." She looked up, fear and trust warring in her eyes. "I will not harm you," he said, the words heavy with truth. "You have my word." She nodded. Old Blue carried them slowly through the snow. Eloise sat sideways behind Thatcher, her hands barely touching the saddle, scared to hold on and scared to fall. Thatcher's voice stayed low and calm as he pointed out landmarks, more to steady her nerves than anything else. By the time they reached the ranch, she was trembling from cold and exhaustion. His cabin looked small against the snow-covered hills, a lonely place built for two and haunted by one. Inside, silence swallowed them both. "You can use the spare room," he said, "just for the night. Just until the thaw, just until he took her to Millwater, just until he set her free." But Eloise looked around the quiet cabin, the dusty table, the cold hearth, the empty chair beside his, and made her own decision. "I will earn my keep," she said softly. She went to the kitchen and began cleaning. Scrubbing the stove, washing pans, straightening shelves. Her hands moved with practiced skill. Thatcher stood frozen, watching her bring life back into a room he'd let fall into shadow. That night, she made biscuits and beans. Simple food, but warm and filling. He ate in silence while she sat across from him, hands folded. It should have been awkward. Instead, it felt like the first warm night after a long winter. The next morning dawned sharp and bright. The world glittered with melting snow. Eloise moved through the house with quiet purpose, sweeping, washing, mending. Thatcher saddled his horse with a tension he didn't understand. It was supposed to be one night, one storm, then goodbye. But as days passed, the snow melted into deep mud. Wagons couldn't travel. The road was a river of brown slush. Every day the ranch held tight to the woman who brought warmth into the rooms he had let grow cold. One day he found her in the barn, kneeling beside a sick calf. Her hands were gentle and sure as she worked with herbs and warm water. Thatcher watched from the doorway, skeptical. "That calf won't make it," he said. Eloise didn't look up. "It deserves a chance." She spent 2 days tending it, coaxing it to stand, feeding it herbs her mother taught her to mix, whispering softly to it. On the third morning, the calf stood, wobbly, but alive. Thatcher looked at her with something new in his eyes. Respect, maybe something deeper. That night, the ranch felt warmer. The silence between them turned soft instead of empty, but in small towns, silence never stays quiet. One evening, Thatcher spotted a rider on the ridge. Bart Hutchkins, watching the cabin, watching Eloise, whispering future trouble into the wind. Eloise saw it too, and fear clouded her eyes. Thatcher felt a hot, sharp protectiveness rise in his chest. The thaw came at last, and with it came a decision. "I'll take you to town tomorrow," he told her. She stood still in the golden light of the morning sun. Then she reached for the letter Jake had written and showed him the watermark. The paper came from Millwater General Store. Thatcher felt the ground shift beneath him. The truth was no longer a storm outside. It stood in front of him, quiet and clear. Jake Monroe had forged the letter, and he had dragged Eloise into Thatcher's grief. Thatcher's voice hardened. "Get your things. We're going to see Jake." He didn't know it yet, but that choice would set off a fire that would sweep through the whole town. What if the truth meant to save a man was the very truth that could destroy him? That was the shadow hanging over Millwater the morning Thatcher Cain and Eloise Mercer rode into town to confront the man who had changed both their lives with one forged letter. The wagon wheels cut deep tracks through the drying mud. Thatcher held the reins tight, his jaw firm, his eyes fixed ahead. Eloise sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, the letter tucked safely away. Fear pressed against her ribs, but something steadier lived there too. Courage. When they pulled up outside Jake Monroe's general store, Jake looked up from behind the counter. He froze. The moment Thatcher laid the letter on the counter, Jake's face drained of color. "Tell me what this is," Thatcher said. Jake didn't run, didn't dodge, didn't lie. Instead, he let out a long breath and said, "I wrote it. I did it to save you." Eloise saw the hurt in Thatcher's eyes, but she also saw something else. A weight lifting, a truth coming to light. Their confrontation was cut short when Bart Hutchkins swaggered through the door with his drinking partners. His grin was sharp and mean. "Well now," Bart said loudly so the whole store could hear, "ain't this a picture? Cain and his little mail-order bride? Heard she made herself right at home in your bed." The air went still. Thatcher didn't shout. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stepped forward until his shadow fell over Bart. "You'll apologize to Miss Mercer," he said, each word cold and firm. "And if I don't?" Bart smirked. Thatcher's hand hovered over his holster. Bart's face blanched. His bravado crumbled. I'm sorry, ma'am." "Louder," Thatcher said. "I'm sorry," Bart said again, clearer this time. He left with his tail tucked, but Thatcher knew this wasn't over. Bart wasn't a man to forgive humiliation. Back at the ranch, peace didn't last. Thatcher fell sick, his body worn from storms, cold, and stress. Fever took him hard. Eloise cared for him day and night. Cool cloths, warm broths, whispered comfort in the darkness. She fought for him with every ounce of strength she had. And when he finally opened his eyes, clear and steady, it was her face he saw. But illness has a way of leaving its mark. Days later, Eloise collapsed in the kitchen. The fever that took him now took her. Thatcher carried her to the spare room with hands shaking worse than any winter storm. She had given everything to save him. Now he would give everything to save her. He stayed at her bedside, wiping her brow, murmuring to her when nightmares tightened her breath. When she called out Garrett's name in fear, something inside Thatcher twisted with fury and protectiveness. "No one will ever hurt you again," he whispered. When her fever broke, their bond was something forged in fire and darkness. Something real. Days later, trouble returned. A flash flood threatened the calves. Thatcher tied himself to a rope and fought through raging water to save what he could. When the current dragged him under, it was Eloise who threw the rope. Eloise who dug her heels into the mud. Eloise who refused to let the water take him. That night, as they recovered, fire lit the valley. Bart Hutchkins, drunk on revenge, had set the pasture ablaze. Thatcher ran into the flames with wet sacks and a shovel. Jake and 2 ranchers arrived just in time, beating the fire back until the wind gave up, and darkness took the field. Bart had declared war, and war didn't wait long. Days later, a polished man in a bowler hat stepped off the noon stagecoach. Mr. Garrett, the man Eloise had run from. The man who had kept a debt book no one could ever escape. He arrived at Thatcher's ranch with Bart at his side. Eloise went pale. "You ran from me," Garrett said, smoothing his coat, "and now your debt follows you." Thatcher stepped between them, a wall of muscle and fury. "She owes you nothing." Garrett smiled thinly. "The law will decide that." And so, the next day at noon, the entire town gathered to hear who held the truth. Garrett spoke first. Contracts, debts, impropriety, twisted tales. Then Thatcher spoke, steady, unafraid, honest. But the breaking moment came when Jake Monroe stepped forward, the letter in his hand. "I wrote it," Jake said, every word. A gasp rose from the crowd. Garrett's case cracked open like an egg. Then a girl from a passing wagon train stepped forward, Mary Ann, a runaway from Garrett's boarding house. With shaking hands, she spoke the truth. "He keeps us in debt so we can't leave. None of it is real." The crowd murmured. Garrett's face paled. His threats collapsed. His lies collapsed. And then Thatcher stepped forward and unbuckled his gun belt. He let it fall to the dirt. "No weapons," he said. "If you want to take her back, you go through me, with your hands." Garrett swung first, wild and desperate. Thatcher dodged and delivered 2 clean blows. Garrett went down hard. Justice didn't always need a gun. When Garrett crawled to his feet, Thatcher forced him to sign a statement renouncing all claims on Eloise and Mary Ann. Witnessed. Stamped. Final. Garrett left Millwater bruised and beaten. Bart, exposed for his part, found himself shunned by every man in town. By nightfall, he had disappeared from Millwater for good. The storm that had chased Eloise across states had finally broken. That evening, on the back porch of the ranch, Thatcher held her hands in his. "Our month is over," he said softly. "We have been through flood, fire, and fear, and still, you're here. I don't want to lie. I want a life. With you." Eloise's breath caught. "I want that too." Thatcher sank to one knee. "Eloise Mercer, will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Thatcher, yes." Their wedding was simple, honest, filled with the few people who mattered. Jake stood beside Thatcher. Sarah Monroe handed Eloise wildflowers. The church windows glowed with warm light as Thatcher slid a gold band onto her finger. A new chapter began. Time softened the edges of old hurt. Thatcher and Eloise built a life together. A thriving ranch, a garden full of healing herbs, a schoolhouse repaired by Thatcher's own hands, and the quiet respect of a town that had once doubted her. 1 year later, Eloise carried their child beneath her heart. Thatcher carved a cradle from pine with his own hands. Smooth edges, soft curves, 2 roses intertwined on the headboard. A tribute to the past and a promise to the future. Their son Samuel was born as the aspens turned gold. And on a warm Wyoming evening, with the mountains painted in sunset light and their baby sleeping in the cradle Thatcher built, Eloise stepped onto the porch and looked at the life she never expected to find. Thatcher stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, laying his cheek against her hair. "Never thought a wrong train could bring me home," he murmured. Eloise smiled, leaning back into him. "Sometimes the wrong road is the only road that leads where you belong." The cabin glowed with warm lamplight behind them. The mountains stood quiet and steady, and their love, hard-won, honest, and unbreakable, was the truest thing for miles.